All right, so the two easiest ways to distinguish between and among the different kinds of conifers are by their cones and by their needles, right? So I have an example of some spruces and some firs and some pines here, and maybe we'll talk cones first. So generally the cone is there are usually two kinds of cones on a conifer, male cones and female cones. The female cones are the cones that produce seed. Male cones produce pollen. So similar to a lot of flowers, these are kind of the equivalent of the flowering structure of other plants. So what I have here is a cone from a ponderosa pine. Pine cones, of all of the different kinds of conifers, only pine cones have these very woody scales on the cone, so they're very easy to distinguish. They come in different sizes, different shapes, but they all have these very woody, get this a little closer to the camera here, these very woody scales. The seeds would actually be down inside these scales, and different kinds of pines would require different kinds of activities to happen for the seeds to be spread. Many are spread by birds, some need to be exposed to extremely cold temperatures or fire in order for these scales to open up and for the seeds to come out. So the main thing to think about, though, in terms of distinguishing are pine cones, very woody. Next thing we have be a spruce cone. These spruce cones, this is from a Colorado blue spruce. They have similar structure with the scales, but these are very papery, very thin scales. You can rub your hand over them, going with the grain. Feels pretty good. It doesn't kind of poke you the way the pine cones do. And similarly, the seeds live down in inside the scales there. And these seeds would be spread by the wind. Very tiny, tiny seeds. But what we're thinking about here are these fine, papery scales. Now, true fir cones are a little hard to come by. They are the only conifer in which the cones will actually, they grow near the top of the tree and they grow pointing upwards. So this is only a partial cone. What happens with fir trees, generally speaking, is once the cones ripen through the end of the summer, they actually disintegrate and will fall to pieces. You can see that these things just pop right off. I found this after sitting under the snow all winter, so there's not much left. There's a little bit of seed left in here, actually. But they will grow on the top of the tree. They will grow upright, as opposed to other conifers where they'll hang down. So if you were looking at a spruce tree, the cones would hang like this. Fir tree would be up at the top. And the native fir trees we have here in Utah, white fir and subalpine fir, they'll grow up near the top, and when they are ripening, they'll actually be usually kind of like a dark green to even really a nice purple color. And they'll be very tightly packed till they ripen, and then they will sort of disintegrate. A lot of times birds and small mammals, squirrels and things, will knock them to pieces. If you're a fir tree in the woods, you will often see on the base a huge midden of these little scales that have accumulated over decades of squirrels and birds ripping these apart to get at the seed. So that is a fir cone. It's from a white fir. Then maybe the easiest to recognize, this is from a Douglas fir, which is actually not a true fir, even though we call it a Douglas fir. It's in its own genus altogether. And this, when it's on the tree, will be a much blonder color. But you can see, if you get close, it has these little, call them bracts maybe, hanging out between the scales. And that is the only conifer that has that. So these are really easy to distinguish once you look closely and you find a cone. And they tend to be on larger trees and closer to the crown of the tree. So sometimes you might have to take a step back and look a little higher up to find it, but you'll see them, and they're easily recognized by these little bracts coming out. So those are the four main kinds of cones you would find. Another really great way to distinguish is the needles. So we have, we'll start with the pine needles. So this is actually from a bristlecone pine. The easiest way to distinguish pines from other species is pines, the needles will always be coming out of the branch in multiples. So there's almost never a single needle coming out. Occasionally it'll happen because as the the tree sheds needles. Sometimes they don't all shed together, but look at a couple different bunches of needles, and there's generally more than one coming out, right? So in a bristlecone, usually there's 5. Occasionally you'll find one with 4 or 3 for the same reason. Sometimes you have to actually spread them apart, especially on a pinyon pine when they're new needles. A lot of times they'll be kind of stuck together, and you'll have to spread them out like that. But yeah, what you're looking for pines, multiple needles in every bunch. Between spruce and fir, the easiest way to distinguish, spruce trees have spiky needles, right? So this one actually, as I was cutting it from a branch, actually cut my thumb. That's how spiky they are. This is from that same blue spruce that the cone was from. So if you're rubbing them, you're going with the grain, it feels okay, but if you try to go against the grain, they're very stiff. The ends of the needles are very spiky, to the point where they will, in fact, puncture your skin sometimes. So spruce, spiky, spiny, stiff needles. And then fir tree, these are, let's do this one first. This is from a white fir, and fir trees, the needles are soft and pliable. They're friendly fir trees, people like to say, so you can rub your hand all over them. They feel pretty good, not gonna hurt you. They tend to also be flat, right? So these spruce needles were kind of rounded, they almost have 4 sides to them, a little bit of square, but a lot of dimensionality there. These fir needles are flat, right? And that's the same for white fir and for subalpine fir, and all fir needles have that nice softness. Not as pliable as most pine needles, but you can do this, not gonna cut yourself, doesn't feel bad. And then finally, the Doug fir, here it is. Doug fir, similarly, really soft needles, also flat, so it's easy to distinguish from the spruce. As far as between the white fir and the Doug fir, it's a little hard to tell just from the needles, but you can tell that on a Doug fir, they kind of grow all the way around evenly from the stem, from the branch, whereas white fir, they tend to grow in a couple rows, sort of side-by-side rows. It's a little hard to tell, I would imagine, on that screen. But you can certainly tell fir, even Doug fir, even though it's not a true fir, has those soft needles. So, firs, flat, friendly, soft needles. Spruces, spiky, spiny, they will cut you sometimes. Pines, they grow in multiples, never singly, those needles. Yeah, so hopefully that will be helpful next time you're out and you're getting a little confused. They're not all pine trees. Thanks a lot.